The letter was old when the First World War began. Not old in the way that Magna Carta is old, or the Iliad, or the Psalms. Old in the way of things that are preserved, studied, placed in archives, approached with the specific reverence that important old things receive. Old in a different way. Old the way a rumor is old, passed from hand to hand, copied and recopied, never quite the same twice, never institutionalized, never authorized, never owned by anyone in a way that required them to take responsibility for it. Old the way a disease is old, surviving, because it found in human biology a weakness it could exploit, and that weakness did not change as the centuries changed. The letter circulating in the trenches of the Somme was not the original. There was no single original, or rather, the original had long since dissolved into the hundreds of copies that had been made of it. Each copy slightly different, each copy adding or losing a detail or a thread or a promise, all of them retaining the essential structure that had made the thing work in the first place. The structure was this: a claim of divine authorship, a set of instructions, a promise for compliance, a threat for non-compliance, and a specific Cumanex, copy this, pass it on. The number of copies you make determines the magnitude of the blessing or the punishment. 1400 years old, in a trench, still making the same demand, still threatening, still promising, still being copied. A soldier folds the paper carefully, puts it in his own pocket, picks up his rifle. The artillery is closer again. The letter had not protected its previous owner, but the letter is still here. The previous owner is not. And in the specific mathematics of survival and belief, in the particular accounting that a person does when they are in a trench and things are trying to kill them, the letter is still the better bet. The per epistola de Dominica Dei, the letter of the Lord's Day, or the letter about Sunday, is not a single document. This needs to be established clearly, because it is one of the things that makes this episode's subject different from anything else in this series. Every other text we have examined, the Historia Regum Britanniae, the donation of Constantine, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Letters of the Crusades, exists as a document, as a text with an author, an original form, a history of transmission that can be traced. The letter from heaven has none of these properties. There is no original. There is no author. There is no single text. There are hundreds of versions surviving in manuscripts from the 6th century through the 15th that share a common structure, a common set of claims, a common set of instructions, and enough variation in the specific details to make it clear that the text has been continuously modified by every person who copied it. Every copyist was also an editor. Every editor was also a transmitter. Every transmission introduced small changes that made the next copy slightly different from the last, and often slightly more extreme, slightly more threatening, slightly more promising, because the copyists understood, on some level, what made the letter effective and emphasized those elements in the version they produced. The letter we are examining, the letter that represents the common structure across all of these versions, is a reconstruction, a synthesis. The letter that all the versions are versions of, it probably looks something like this: a statement of origin, a claim that the letter has come from God, or from Jesus Christ, or from an angel of God, the specific divine source varies between versions. The claim of supernatural origin is constant, a set of instructions about Sunday observance. The day is holy. It must not be used for work. It must not be used for commerce. It must not be used for warfare. A specific, pointed instruction in a world where warfare was a regular feature of human life. Those who observe Sunday properly will be blessed. Good harvests, good health, protection from enemies, protection from disease. Those who do not observe Sunday, who work, who fight, who treat the Lord's day as any other day, will be punished. Famine, plague, defeat by enemies, death, and then the instruction, the specific instruction that makes this a chain letter rather than simply a religious text. You must copy this letter. You must give copies to others. If you do not copy and distribute it, the punishments described above will fall on you. If you do copy and distribute it, the blessings described above will be yours. The number of copies required varies between versions. Some versions specify 3. Some specify 7. Some specify as many as you can make. But the structure is constant. Your fate, your harvest, your health, your survival depends not just on believing this letter, not just on following its instructions, but on reproducing and distributing it. The letter makes every recipient a participant in its own transmission, makes every reader a potential publisher, makes the chain of copies the condition of the blessing. This is the innovation. This is the thing that made the letter from heaven different from every other piece of religious literature in the 6th century. Not the claim of divine authorship, not the promise of blessing, not even the threat of punishment. All of those were available in existing religious texts. The requirement to copy and forward, that was new. That was the mechanism. That was the thing that would keep the letter alive for 1400 years. Why did it work? That is the question that requires the most careful attention, because the answer is not because people were naive, and not because people were illiterate, and not because the medieval world lacked the critical thinking of our enlightened era. The answer is more interesting and more uncomfortable than any of those. The letter worked because it was designed, whether by a single author or assembled over time by successive copyists, to exploit 4 cognitive mechanisms that are not specific to the 6th century, that are not specific to medieval Christianity, that are present in human cognition in every culture and every era. The 4 mechanisms. First, authority. The letter claims divine authorship. This is not simply a lie told to credulous people. It is the activation of a cognitive shortcut that all human beings use when evaluating information. The question of who is telling us this. We do not evaluate every claim from first principles. We cannot. There is too much information, too many claims, too little time and cognitive resource to subject everything to full critical scrutiny. So we use heuristics. We ask, who is the source? Is the source credible? Does the source have a track record? Does the source have institutional backing? A letter from Jesus Christ scores maximum points on every one of these heuristics within the framework of Christian belief. The source is maximally credible. The source has the ultimate track record. The source has the ultimate institutional backing. The authority claim does not require naivety. It requires only that the recipient accept the framework within which the authority claim is made. Second, loss aversion. The threat in the letter is psychologically more powerful than the promise. This is not a medieval observation. This is a finding of modern behavioral economics, specifically of the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky on prospect theory. Human beings' weight losses more heavily than equivalent gains. The pain of losing something is psychologically greater than the pleasure of gaining the same thing. The letter offers a blessing for compliance and a punishment for non-compliance. Both are specified, but the punishment, famine, plague, death, activates loss aversion more powerfully than the blessing activates desire. The letter works harder through its threat than through its promise. It was designed this way, whether consciously or not, because the person who assembled this structure understood, on some level, what made people comply. Third, the specific content of the threat and promise. The letter does not promise abstract spiritual reward. It promises things that the specific population of the 6th century needed most acutely: food, health, safety from enemies. The threat mirrors the promise: famine, disease, military defeat. These are not abstract punishments. They are the specific, daily fears of a population living in a world of food insecurity, endemic disease, and regular warfare. The letter's specific content was calibrated, whether by one author or assembled over generations, to the specific fears of its target audience. It threatened what they feared most. It promised what they needed most. The precision of the targeting is the reason it worked. Fourth and most important, the copy instruction. The requirement to reproduce the letter does not just ensure transmission. It does something more subtle. It converts the recipient from a passive reader into an active participant. The act of copying the letter, of making it real, material, reproducible, is itself a form of commitment. The person who has copied the letter has invested in it, has staked something on it, their time, their materials, the specific cognitive act of deciding that this is worth reproducing. And the person who has given a copy to someone else, who has made themselves responsible for passing it on, has committed to its value in a way that makes subsequent rejection of it psychologically costly. This is the mechanism of commitment and consistency, another well-documented cognitive pattern by which the act of publicly endorsing something makes a person more likely to continue believing it, because the alternative is to acknowledge that their earlier action was mistaken. The letter does not just spread, it creates committed carriers, people who have invested in it, people for whom the letter's effectiveness is not merely a matter of faith, but of personal sunk cost. This is the design. This is why it has lasted 1400 years. Not because the medieval mind was weaker than ours, because the mechanisms it exploits are present in every mind, in every century, in every culture that has ever produced a human being. The Church condemned it. This requires attention, because the Church's response to the letter from heaven is one of the most revealing aspects of the whole story. The letter was not a fringe phenomenon. It was not a minor irritant on the edge of popular religion that the Church occasionally noted and ignored. The letter was condemned repeatedly, consistently, over the course of centuries, by specific bishops at specific councils, by papal correspondence, by theological treatises, in a way that indicates the Church took it seriously as a problem. the earliest documented condemnation, is attributed to the period of Pope Gregory I. In the late 6th century, approximately contemporary with the letter's earliest documented appearance. Gregory the Great, was not a man who condemned things lightly. He was one of the most important figures in the history of the early medieval papacy, a theologian, an administrator, a missionary organizer, the Pope under whose direction Augustine was sent to convert England. He understood popular religion. He understood what the people of his era believed and why they believed it. When Gregory condemned the letter, he condemned it not merely as a heresy or a theological error, but as something more specific, as a deception, as a document that exploited genuine religious feeling in service of something false. He was right. His condemnation was accurate. His condemnation was also, in practical terms, completely ineffective. The letter continued. The letter has always continued. Every condemnation in the historical record is followed, within a few years or a few decades, by evidence of the letter still circulating, still being copied, still being carried, still being passed from hand to hand by people who believed it or feared not to. This pattern, institutional condemnation, followed by popular persistence, is one of the defining features of the letter's history, and it reveals something important about the limits of institutional authority when confronting a mechanism that operates at the level of individual fear and individual hope. The bishop can condemn the letter. The bishop cannot remove the fear of famine from the person who received the letter, cannot remove the hope that something, anything, might protect their family from the specific dangers that surround them. The letter speaks to those fears and hopes directly, personally, immediately. The bishop speaks to them through the mediation of theology, of institutional authority, of a framework that requires the person to prioritize abstract doctrinal correctness over immediate practical comfort. The letter wins, not because it is more truthful, because it is more useful. We have been here before. This series has been here before. The competition between what is true and what is useful, and the consistent victory of the useful over the merely true, is the thread that runs through every episode. The letter from heaven is perhaps the purest case, the simplest, the one in which the mechanism is most naked, most legible, most directly present in the structure of the text itself. No forger with a political agenda, no emperor trying to legitimize his power, no traumatized inquisitor building a system of revenge. Just a structure, a set of 4 components: threat, promise, authority, copy, working together, working automatically, working on everyone who receives them, in every century, regardless of their intelligence, or their faith, or the specific content of their education. The mechanism running the letters, its specific instructions about Sunday observance, was not random. In the 6th century, the question of Sunday observance was an active theological and political question. The Council of Laodicea, in the 4th century, had formally declared Sunday a Christian day of rest, replacing the Jewish Sabbath. But the enforcement of this declaration was uneven. In rural areas, far from institutional authority, the rhythms of agricultural life did not always accommodate the requirements of the church calendar. Planting and harvesting do not wait for Sunday. Markets function when the buyers and sellers can reach them. Warfare in a world of endemic low-level conflict does not pause because the Church has designated a day of rest. The letter addressed this directly. It did not argue for Sunday observance. Through theological reasoning, did not explain why Sunday was holy, did not situate the instruction in the framework of Scripture and tradition. It bypassed the reasoning. It went straight to the consequences. Observe Sunday, your harvest will be good. Violate Sunday, your harvest will fail. This is not theological argument. This is not even moral exhortation. This is the most direct possible relationship between instruction and outcome. If you do this, good things happen. If you do not do this, bad things happen. No intermediary, no explanation, no framework required. The behavioral economists call this type of messaging outcome-based framing, the specific technique of presenting a behavior, not in terms of its intrinsic rightness, but in terms of its consequences for the person whose behavior is requested. Not, Sunday is holy and should be observed, but if you observe Sunday, your crops will not fail. The letter's authors, whoever they were, understood that the people they were addressing were not primarily interested in the intrinsic holiness of Sunday. They were interested in their crops, in their children's health, in their safety. The letter met them there, where they actually were, with the actual fears and needs they actually had. This is also why the letter's specific content shifted over the centuries. As the primary fears changed, as the specific anxieties of each era took on different forms, the letter's specific threats and promises adapted to match. In an era of plague, the letter promised protection from plague. In an era of warfare, the letter promised protection in battle. In an era of drought, the letter promised rain. The structure was constant. The specific content was always calibrated to the specific fears of the specific people who were receiving it at that specific moment. The letter was not static. The letter was responsive. The letter was, in the most precise sense, a living text, one that changed as it moved through time, because the people who copied it made it say what their moment required it to say, which is to say, the letter was collaborative. Its authors were everyone, whoever copied it. Its specific content was shaped by every person, whoever made a change, adding a threat, adjusting a promise, specifying the number of copies required. In the version they reproduced, the letter was not forged. The letter was grown, like a rumor, like a myth, like every living thing that persists through time by adapting to what time requires. The letter was condemned by Pope Gregory I. It was condemned at the Council of Fraga in Spain. It was condemned by bishops in France, Germany, England. It was condemned by theologians and scholars for 14 centuries without interruption. Every condemnation was correct. The letter was not from heaven. The letter was not from Jesus Christ. The letter was a fraud, one of the most durable frauds in human history. And every condemnation failed, not because the condemners were weak or wrong or insufficient, because the mechanism the letter used did not require belief to function. It required only fear and hope and the specific human response to having a piece of paper in your hand that says, "Copy me," or something bad will happen. Fear and hope have not been condemned out of existence in 14 centuries. The letter is still running. The condemners are in the archive. The letter is in the pocket. The first 2 centuries of the letter's existence, the 7th and 8th centuries, are the period we know least about. The historical documentation is sparse. The manuscript tradition is fragmentary. We can infer the letter's spread from the condemnations that mention it, the bishops and councils that found it necessary to formally denounce it, which tells us where it was present well enough to constitute a problem, but not how many copies existed, not through what networks they were moving, not what the specific population of letter carriers looked like. What we can say with confidence, the letter moved through the monastic networks of early medieval Europe. The monasteries were the communication infrastructure of the post-Roman West, the places where literate people gathered, where manuscripts were copied, where communication between distant communities was mediated. A letter that entered the monastic network could travel very far without anyone needing to carry it specifically. It would be copied, filed with other texts, carried to another monastery as part of a manuscript exchange, copied there, sent. The letter was not spreading through a dedicated distribution system. It was spreading through the general purpose infrastructure of medieval knowledge transmission, hitchhiking, essentially, on the copying culture that was preserving everything else. This is its first great advantage over texts that required specific institutional support to survive. The donation of Constantine survived because the papal administration had reasons to preserve it. The Malleus Maleficarum survived because it was printed and distributed by Kramer's deliberate effort. The Crusade letters survived because chroniclers embedded them in histories. The letter from heaven required none of this. It survived because every person who received it had a personal reason, fear, hope. The copy instruction itself to make another copy. It was self-preserving. It carried its own preservation mechanism in its text. Copy me or something bad will happen. And people copied it. Without institutional support, without deliberate preservation, without anyone deciding that this text was worth saving. They copied it because the text told them to. That was sufficient. The 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries brought new pressures to Europe. Viking raids in the north and west, Magyar raids from the east, Saracen raids in the south, and with new pressures came new versions of the letter. The specific threats that the letter described were updated. In the original 6th century versions, the letter's threats were primarily agricultural: famine, failed harvests, the specific fears of a population whose survival depended on each year's crop. In the versions circulating in the 9th and 10th centuries, the versions copied by monks in Irish and English monasteries under the shadow of Viking raids, the letter's threats began to include specific military language, protection from enemies, safety in battle, the specific promise that the person who carried the letter would not die by the sword. This was not a theological development. It was a market response. The specific population receiving the letter had specific fears, and the letter, through the continuous process of copying and adaptation, had adjusted its content to address those fears. The letter was not edited by a single editor making a deliberate decision. It was edited by hundreds of individual copyists, each of whom made small adjustments, adding a phrase, expanding a threat, specifying a promise based on their own assessment of what would make the letter more persuasive to the person they were giving it to. This is crowdsourced editing. This is, in the most precise sense, the medieval version of the A/B testing that modern digital platforms use to optimize content for engagement. The versions that were most effective at producing copies were most likely to be copied. The versions that were less effective were less likely to survive. Over generations, the surviving versions are the most effective versions, not because anyone designed an optimal letter, because the process of selection produced one. The letter became, over centuries, increasingly precisely calibrated to the fears and hopes of its recipients, not through intelligence or deliberate design, but through the blind process of what survives being what copies itself. This is, structurally, the same process that produces the evolution of biological organisms. Variation plus sélection equals adaptation. The letter from heaven evolved over 1400 years into increasingly effective forms through the same process that produced the human immune system and the color of a butterfly's wing. No designer, only selection, only what survives, surviving. The 14th century brought the Black Death. We examine the Black Death in episode 3 in the context of the blood libel and the Jewish scapegoating that accompanied the plague. Here we return to it from a different angle, not the social violence it produced, but the specific effect it had on the transmission of the letter from heaven. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347. The 1353. It had killed between 30 and 50% of Europe's population, the most catastrophic demographic event in recorded European history. And in the specific context of that catastrophe of a population that had no medical explanation for what was happening to them, no institutional response capable of addressing the scale of the dying, no framework of causation that gave them any purchase on what was killing them. The letter from heaven experienced its greatest period of growth. A specific timing is documented in the manuscript record. More surviving copies of the letter date from the 14th century than from any previous century. Not because the letter was different, because the need was greater. A population in which 1 in 3 people would die within 5 years had a specific relationship to the letter's promise and the letter's threat that a population in normal times could not fully replicate. Every promise in the letter, health, survival, protection, was precisely what the dying needed. Every threat in the letter, disease, death, was precisely what the dying feared. The gap between what the letter offered and what the current situation provided was never wider, which meant the letter was never more appealing. The specific irony, and it is an irony, the letter's users were not in a position to appreciate, is that the Black Death spread partly through the same informal social networks that the letter spread through. People gathering, people sharing, people in close contact with others who were transmitting something they did not know they were transmitting. The plague spread through proximity. The letter spread through proximity. Both were most active in the communities that were most connected, in the nodes of the network where things spread fastest. They spread together. The same network, the same mechanisms. The letter promising protection from the plague was moving through the same channels that the plague was moving through. The carriers of the letter were often carriers of the disease. The promise of protection was transmitted by the very medium of infection. This is not metaphor. This is documented historical fact, and it is one of the more terrible, specific details of the 14th century letter's history. The printing press arrived in the 1450s. We have encountered the printing press twice already in this series, in episode 4, where it was the mechanism that made the Malleus Maleficarum unstoppable, and in episode 5, where it was the broader context of information change that accelerated the Crusades' amplification. In the context of the letter from heaven, the printing press did something specific and somewhat ironic. Before the press, the letter was hand-copied. Each copy was the result of a deliberate decision by a specific person to invest their time and materials in reproduction. Each copy was, in a sense, a personal commitment, the work of an individual who had chosen to make it. After the press, the letter could be printed by anyone with access to a press, which, by the late 15th century, meant a significant number of commercial printers operating in every major city. This should have diluted the personal commitment aspect, should have made the letter less charged, less personal, more like any other printed commodity. Instead, the press did what the press did to everything it touched. It made it faster. The specific dynamic of the printed letter was different from the hand-copied letter in one important respect. The instruction to copy became, after the press, the instruction to buy and distribute. You could purchase a stack of copies from a printer and distribute them. The effort required was less than hand copying. The number of copies was greater. The letter's reach expanded, and the printers, commercial actors in the business of selling printed material, discovered that the letter from heaven sold well. People bought it. Not all people, but enough people, in enough cities, to make it commercially viable. The printer did not need to believe the letter. The printer needed to sell copies, and copies sold, because people bought them, because people were afraid, because the mechanism had not changed. The printing press did not transform the letter. It industrialized it, made it cheaper, made it more widely available, removed the specific barrier of needing to know someone who had a copy. You could now buy a copy at the bookstore, alongside the sermon pamphlets and the almanacs and the Bible printed in your own language for the first time. The letter from heaven was a commercial product. It had always been a kind of product. It had always been traded, exchanged, given as a gift. Now it was a literal commodity, priced, sold, distributed, at scale. Martin Luther's Reformation was, in part, a war over what the printing press should be used for. His answer: Scripture, theology, education, the Word of God, as defined by rigorous scholarship. The answer that the market gave: everything, including the letter from heaven, including whatever people would pay for, including, especially, the things that addressed the fears that scholarship could not address, because scholarship did not promise to protect you. The letter did. The 16th century brought the Reformation, and the Reformation brought the letter into direct confrontation with the most powerful anti-superstition movement in the history of Western Christianity. Martin Luther was not a moderate. His theology of grace, salvation by faith alone, not by works, not by the purchasing of indulgences, not by the performance of rituals, was a direct assault on the specific mechanisms through which the medieval church had channeled popular religiosity into institutional forms. Luther believed and argued powerfully and at length that the specific popular practices of late medieval Christianity were corruptions, superstitions, obstacles to the true faith, things that needed to be swept away so that the genuine encounter between the individual soul and the Word of God could take place unmediated. The letter from heaven was exactly the kind of thing Luther would have condemned. Exactly the kind of popular religiosity, magical thinking. The belief that a physical object could confer spiritual protection, that his theology was designed to replace. Luther did condemn it, and so did Calvin, and so did the other major Reformation theologians, and so did the Catholic reformers of the Council of Trent, who were, in their own way, trying to purify popular Catholic practice of its more extravagant, superstitious elements. The 16th century was the most sustained and most theologically sophisticated assault on the letter from heaven in its history. The assault failed. The letter survived the Reformation the way it had survived every previous institutional assault, by operating below the level at which institutional authority was effective. The Reformation transformed the theological landscape of Europe permanently, irreversibly. It changed what people believed about salvation, about Scripture, about the relationship between the individual and the divine. It did not change what people feared. It did not change what people hoped for. It did not change the specific vulnerability to a message that said, copy this or your crops will fail. The theological revolution ran at a different level from the mechanism. The mechanism ran deeper. The 17th and 18th centuries produced something interesting in the letter's history, the first systematic scholarly attempts to understand and document it, not to condemn it, to study it. The Enlightenment, the great intellectual movement of the 17th and 18th centuries that placed reason, evidence, and systematic inquiry at the center of human knowledge, produced, among other things, a new kind of relationship with texts like the letter from heaven, where previous centuries had condemned the letter from within the same religious framework as the letter itself, where the condemnation was always, this is a false claim of divine authority. The Enlightenment scholars approached it differently. They were interested in it as a phenomenon, as an example of popular belief, as evidence of what people had believed and feared and hoped for. This is the beginning of the historical study of misinformation, the beginning of the discipline that this channel is practicing right now. The moment when a society starts asking not just, is this false, but why does it spread? What makes it work? What does it spread? Tell us about the people who spread it. The first serious scholarly treatment of the letter from heaven was produced in this period. The manuscript tradition was catalogued. The variations were documented. The history of condemnations was assembled into a timeline. The scholars found the letter fascinating. They found it fascinating in a way that the bishops who had condemned it had not found it, because the bishops were trying to stop it, while the scholars were trying to understand it, and understanding it, understanding the mechanism, the psychology, the specific design features that made it work, did not. It should be noted. Stop it. The letter continued through the Enlightenment, while Voltaire was writing about the folly of superstition. The letter from heaven was still being copied in the villages of France, while Hume was developing his critique of miracles. The letter was still being sold at markets in England. Understanding the mechanism is not the same as disabling the mechanism. The mechanism runs on fear. The scholars understood the mechanism. The fear remained. The mechanism continued. The 19th century brought two things that transformed the letter's context without changing its mechanism. The first, mass literacy. By the mid-19th century, in most Western European countries, the majority of adults could read and write, a transformation from the situation of the 6th century, so complete as to constitute a different world. The letter from heaven had been designed or had evolved into a form that worked on a largely illiterate population, spread through networks where reading was a specialized skill. In a world of mass literacy, the letter did not decline. It adapted. The adaptations were specific. The language became less formal, less Latin, more colloquial. The layout changed from manuscript to printed pamphlet to the specific visual conventions of popular print culture. The distribution channel shifted from monastery to market to the new mass media of the 19th century. Newspapers, periodicals, the cheap print culture that accompanied industrialization. The letter found new forms and new media. Always the same structure, always the same 4 parts. Always threat, promise, authority, copy, the second transformation, the telegraph. And after the telegraph, the postal system at industrial scale. For the first time, the physical copy instruction, make copies of this letter and send them to others, could be executed not just by hand delivery, but by post. The Victorian postal system, cheap, fast, reliable, was, for the letter, what the printing press had been 4 centuries earlier, a step change in reach. You did not need to know someone who had a copy. You could receive a copy by post from a stranger. You could send copies by post to strangers. The chain could extend far beyond the physical network of people you actually knew. The chain letter, in its distinctively modern form, the letter that explicitly requests you to send it to a specific number of people within a specific time frame, fully crystallizes in this period. The Victorian chain letter is the direct descendant of the 6th century letter from heaven. The same structure, the same mechanism, a new infrastructure, a new scale. And it is in this form, the Victorian chain letter, the printed letter sent by post, that the mechanism enters the 20th century. In the trenches of the Somme, the letter was in the trenches, on both sides, in French, in German, in English. The soldiers who carried it came from different countries, different languages, different religious traditions. Some of them were devout. Some of them had not been in a church since childhood. Some of them did not believe in anything they could name. All of them were in a trench. All of them were afraid. All of them had a piece of paper that promised slightly better odds. The letter did not care which side it was on. It never had. The mechanism was neutral. The mechanism worked on fear. Fear was present everywhere, on both sides, in every language, in every trench, in every pocket, where someone had put the letter and decided to keep it, just in case it worked, just in case the promise was real. The letter had been making that promise since the 6th century. It was still making it in 1916. It would still be making it 100 years later, because the promise does not expire, because fear does not expire, because the mechanism does not expire, because the mechanism does not need time to pass. It needs only the next person who opens it. The 20th century gave the letter from heaven 3 new media in succession: the fax, the email, the SMS, and then, in the 21st century, social media. Each transition was the same. The medium changed. The mechanism did not. The email chain letter appeared in the 1990s, almost immediately, After email became widely available, the earliest documented examples date to the early 1990s. Within a few years of commercial internet access, the email chain letter was faster than the fax. It was free. It required no paper, no printer, no postage. The cost of forwarding it was zero, and the instruction, "Forward this to everyone you know," was now executable with a single click. The friction that had always been present in the chain, the effort of copying, the cost of postage, the time required to address envelopes had been reduced to almost nothing. What happens to a mechanism when the friction is removed? It accelerates. The email chain letter could reach thousands of people in hours, could spread across continents in a day, could be forwarded by millions of people before any institutional authority had even noticed it existed. The speed did not change. The mechanism was already designed to exploit individual psychology, to bypass critical evaluation through the combination of authority, threat, promise, and the specific commitment produced by the act of forwarding. The speed simply gave the mechanism more opportunities, more inboxes, more moments of individual decision, more people, in more contexts, receiving the same four-part message and making the same calculation. What is the cost of forwarding this? Zero. What is the risk of not forwarding it? Potentially something bad. When the cost is zero and the risk of non-compliance is non-zero, however small, the rational calculation favors forwarding. The email chain letter is not a different thing from the 6th century letter. It is the same thing with the friction removed, the same mechanism, operating faster, reaching more people, because the medium made it faster and cheaper. Not because fear changed, because the infrastructure of fear became more efficient. Why doesn't knowing help? This is the question that this episode has been building toward. We know the mechanism. We have known the mechanism since at least the 17th century, since the first scholarly studies of the letter's transmission. We can name the 4 components. We can explain precisely why each one works on human psychology. We can trace the history of 1400 years of institutional failure to stop the mechanism through condemnation. We know all of this, and the mechanism is still running. Today, right now, in the social media feeds of the people watching this video, in the messaging apps, on their phones, in the email inboxes, they will check after this. The chain letter, in whatever form it currently takes, is present in their lives, has been present recently, will be present again. Why doesn't knowing stop it? The answer is not flattering, and it is not specific to any particular group of people, to the uneducated, the superstitious, the credulous. The answer is this: knowing the mechanism operates at the level of conscious, deliberate cognition. The mechanism operates at a different level. The authority claim does not need to convince your conscious mind that the letter is from Jesus Christ. It needs only to activate, briefly and partially, the cognitive shortcut that says this comes from a source that claims authority. That activation happens before conscious evaluation, before you have decided whether to believe it. The threat does not need to convince you that something bad will happen if you don't comply. It needs only to activate, briefly and partially, the loss aversion mechanism to generate the specific, unpleasant feeling of potential loss. That feeling happens before conscious evaluation The copy instruction does not need to convince you that forwarding the message is the right thing to do. It needs only to reduce the friction of forwarding below the threshold at which evaluation is triggered. In the era of the share button, that threshold is very low. You can know, consciously, that a message is a chain letter. You can recognize the structure. You can know it has no divine authority. You can know the threat is empty, and you can still feel the slight, unpleasant pull, the specific discomfort of not forwarding it that the mechanism produces. And in the moment of discomfort, in the moment when the cost of forwarding is zero, and the discomfort of not forwarding is non-zero, you forward it, not because you believe it, because the mechanism is faster than belief. This is not a failure of intelligence. This is not a failure of education. This is the mechanism working exactly as designed, working on the level beneath conscious evaluation, working on the fear that exists before thought. The letter from heaven does not need you to believe it. It needs you to feel it. And feeling is faster than knowing. Always. In every century. In every medium. In every pocket where someone has put the letter and decided to keep it. Just in case. The letter from heaven is the oldest viral content in recorded history. Not the oldest piece of writing. Not the oldest religious text. Not the oldest claim of divine authority. The oldest viral content. The oldest text, designed from the beginning to reproduce itself through individual human action, exploiting individual human psychology without requiring any institutional support. Every other text in this series needed something else to spread. Geoffrey of Monmouth needed kings who needed a prophecy. The donation of Constantine needed a papacy with political needs. The blood libel needed a crisis to attach itself to. The Malleus Maleficarum needed the printing press and Kramer's distribution effort. The Crusade letters needed the preaching network of the medieval church. The Frederick myth needed successive generations of political movements to pick it up and use it. The letter from heaven needed none of these. It needed only the person holding it. That is the specific achievement of its design, whether that design was deliberate or emerged through centuries of selection and adaptation. It made every recipient the mechanism of its own transmission. It turned the reader into the publisher. It turned the carrier into the distributor. It required no author after the first, and even the first author was immediately replaced by every subsequent copyist who changed a word, adjusted a thread, added a promise. The letter has no author. The letter is everyone who ever copied it. The letter is everyone who ever forwarded it. The letter is you. If you have ever received something that said, forward this, or something bad will happen, and felt, even briefly, the pull of compliance, you are not a victim of the letter. You are a node in its network. You always were. Everyone always was. That is the mechanism. That is the design. That is what 1400 years of continuous operation looks like from the inside. The letter from heaven has been condemned by every religious authority that has encountered it, by every ecclesiastical council that examined it, by every reformer who found it in circulation, by every scholar who studied its history. Every condemnation was correct. The letter is not from heaven. The letter has never been from heaven. Every condemnation failed, not because the condemners were wrong about the letter, because they were addressing the letter, and the letter is not the problem. The problem is the mechanism that the letter carries, the mechanism that the letter was the first to make explicit, to print. Essentially, in the instructions, here is how I spread, here is what you must do, here is what happens if you comply, here is what happens if you do not. The mechanism is older than the letter. The mechanism will outlast the letter. The mechanism will find the next container, the next text, the next claim, the next combination of fear and hope that makes a person reach for the forward button, and it will run in that. The letter is not the problem. You are not the problem. The mechanism is the problem. And the mechanism, threat, promise, authority, copy, has never been solved. Not by bishops, not by reformers, not by scholars, not by the printing press, or the internet, or 14 centuries of institutional prohibition. Not yet.